A judge signed the order with a pen, a seal, and full legal authority behind it. On paper, it was final. Precise language, clear intent, a lawful decision meant to end the influence of Bumpy Johnson once and for all. In the eyes of the court, the matter was settled. The system had spoken. Harlem did not respond. No protests erupted. No open defiance followed. There was no dramatic clash between police and residents. Instead, something far more powerful happened: nothing. The order existed in court files and legal briefs, but on the streets where its impact was supposed to be felt, life continued unchanged. Businesses opened, conversations flowed, influence remained intact. The law was present, yet absent at the same time. This is where the story turns away from crime and into something deeper. Because this was not a failure of procedure or evidence. The judge had the authority. The ruling was valid. What failed was enforcement. And enforcement does not come from ink or seals. It comes from people, from cooperation, from a shared belief that the law deserves to be carried out. In Harlem, that belief did not exist. For many in the community, Bumpy Johnson was not viewed as a problem the court needed to solve. He was seen as a constant in a system that rarely protected them. The court was distant, the law was slow, its outcomes unpredictable. Bumpy, by contrast, was immediate, understood, and embedded in daily life. When the order came down, it didn't clash with fear, it clashed with legitimacy. This is not a story about corruption or intimidation. No one forced Harlem to ignore the ruling. They simply chose not to participate in its execution. No witnesses stepped forward. No information surfaced. No momentum formed. The law stood alone, waiting for a society that refused to move with it. What happens when legal authority exists without consent? When a judge decides, but the community quietly vetoes the outcome? This is the moment where power without law reveals itself, and where the limits of the legal system become impossible to ignore. This is the story of an order meant to end Bumpy Johnson, and how Harlem made sure it never did. From the court's perspective, the case was straightforward. A pattern had been established. Testimony, reports, and legal reasoning converged on a single conclusion. Bumpy Johnson represented an influence the law could no longer tolerate. The judge's order was written with confidence, grounded in statute, and backed by the full authority of the judicial system. It was not symbolic. It was meant to end something, decisively and permanently. In legal terms, the logic was sound. Courts operate on the assumption that once a ruling is issued, the machinery below will move accordingly. Police will act, prosecutors will proceed, witnesses will cooperate. The system is designed as a chain, and the judge's signature is supposed to be the point where that chain locks into motion. This order carried that same expectation. It assumed compliance as a given. What the court failed to account for was context. The ruling treated Bumpy Johnson as an isolated subject, an individual whose influence could be neutralized through legal removal. But in Harlem, his presence was not isolated, it was embedded. He wasn't merely a figure at the top of an operation. He was woven into dispute resolution, economic balance, and informal order. The law addressed a person. Harlem experienced a structure. Judicial authority relies on distance. That distance is what gives it neutrality, but it is also what creates blindness. The order presumed that legality alone would outweigh local legitimacy. That assumption held in courtrooms and filings, but it weakened the moment it crossed into lived reality. Harlem did not experience the order as justice being delivered. It experienced it as an external decision, made without understanding how daily life actually functioned. From the judge's vantage point, the ruling restored order. From Harlem's vantage point, it threatened to remove it. This gap explains why the order, despite its authority, produced no immediate effect. There was no rush of enforcement, because enforcement depends on alignment. Officers require information. Investigators need cooperation. Courts depend on follow-through. When those elements fail to materialize, the order remains legally valid but practically inert. The mistake wasn't in the law itself. It was in believing that law alone is sufficient. The ruling assumed obedience where there was only quiet disagreement, and that assumption would soon collide with a reality the court had no mechanism to correct. The order had been signed. The system had spoken. What remained unclear was whether anyone outside the courthouse intended to listen. The court's mistake wasn't legal, it was cultural. From the bench, Harlem appeared as a jurisdiction like any other, governed by statutes, procedures, and enforceable authority. But on the ground, Harlem operated under a different logic, one shaped by memory, proximity, and lived experience. The law assumed neutrality. The community remembered absence. For decades, residents had learned that formal institutions arrived late and left early. Police presence fluctuated. Court outcomes felt distant and unpredictable. When protection failed to materialize, informal systems filled the gap. Those systems weren't written down, but they were understood. They resolved disputes quickly. They enforced boundaries. They kept daily life moving. In that context, removing a stabilizing figure didn't look like justice, it looked like risk. The court read influence as dominance. Harlem read it as function. This difference mattered. Judicial orders are designed to correct violations, not to replace social infrastructure. But in Harlem, the order was perceived as dismantling something without offering an alternative. No plan explained how disputes would be handled afterward. No reassurance addressed what would happen in the vacuum. The ruling asked for trust without demonstrating understanding. That's why the response was not resistance, but withdrawal. People didn't protest. They didn't obstruct officers. They simply stopped participating. Information dried up. Leads went nowhere. Conversations ended early. The legal process requires inputs, witnesses, tips, corroboration, and Harlem quietly withheld them, not out of fear, but out of calculation. The court also underestimated how legitimacy works at street level. Legitimacy isn't conferred by seals or signatures. It's earned through reliability. When institutions are perceived as inconsistent, their authority becomes conditional. The order assumed automatic compliance. Harlem evaluated consequences. The calculus was simple. Enforcement would introduce uncertainty. Non-cooperation would preserve stability. This wasn't a rejection of law in principle. It was a judgment about which system worked. The court's language spoke in absolutes. The community lived in trade-offs. And when those frames collided, the one rooted in daily survival prevailed. By misreading Harlem as a passive recipient of authority rather than an active arbiter of order, the court misjudged the terrain. The order didn't fail because it was unlawful. It failed because it never secured the one thing it needed to matter outside the courthouse: consent. That realization would soon become unavoidable because without consent, enforcement is not power. It's paperwork waiting for a world that won't move. The order existed. The authority behind it was real. What was missing was the final, fragile link that turns law into action: consent. Courts can decide, but they cannot move on their own. Every ruling assumes a chain reaction police act. Witnesses speak. Neighbors cooperate. Information flows. When any one of those elements withdraws, enforcement slows. When all of them withdraw at once, enforcement stops. In Harlem, that withdrawal was collective and quiet. No one announced it. There were no meetings, no slogans, no organized resistance. The response took the form of everyday choices. Doors stayed closed a few seconds longer. Conversations ended a little earlier. Names weren't volunteered. Schedules became vague. The community didn't challenge the order. It starved it. And because enforcement is cumulative, each small refusal multiplied the next. Police cannot act on orders alone. They need direction, where to look, whom to approach, what patterns matter. Prosecutors need witnesses willing to attach their names to statements. Judges need cases that move forward. In Harlem, those inputs never arrived, not because people were intimidated, but because participation carried no perceived benefit. Cooperation would introduce uncertainty. Silence preserved equilibrium. This exposed a truth the legal system often avoids acknowledging. Law is inert without social buy-in. Authority can compel at the margins, but sustained enforcement depends on a baseline of voluntary compliance. When that baseline collapses, the law remains valid but ineffective. It exists in files, not in streets. The court had issued a command assuming that neutrality would be enough. Harlem responded with a calculation of risk. Who would replace the order that Bumpy Johnson provided? Who would manage disputes while cases dragged through the system? Who would absorb the consequences if enforcement destabilized daily life? The ruling answered none of those questions. So, the community answered in its own way by refusing to help make the ruling real. What made this moment powerful was its restraint. There was no confrontation to punish, no obstruction to prosecute. The law had no adversary to face, only an absence to contend with. And absence is difficult to fight. You cannot arrest silence. You cannot subpoena indifference. Over time, the effect became undeniable. Files stalled. Momentum faded. Resources shifted elsewhere. The order did not collapse in scandal. It expired in practice. Not because it was overturned, but because the society it targeted chose not to animate it. This is the paradox at the heart of enforcement. The state can issue commands, but communities decide whether those commands live or die. In Harlem, consent was withheld, and without it, the law, however precise, had nowhere to go. What followed was not defiance, but continuity. The court's order remained active on paper, yet life in Harlem adjusted around it as if nothing had changed. This is where power without law became visible, not as a challenge to authority, but as an alternative system operating in parallel. Bumpy Johnson did not confront the ruling. He did not test it. He simply continued to exist within a network that rendered the order irrelevant in practice. No instructions were issued to protect him. None were needed. Protection emerged organically through routine behavior. People avoided situations that could generate statements. Interactions stayed informal. Disputes were resolved quietly, away from anything that could be formalized or documented. This wasn't coordination, it was shared intuition. Everyone understood that stability depended on keeping certain processes outside institutional reach. What made this power effective was its low visibility. There were no symbols to dismantle, no hierarchy to penetrate. The law looks for organizations, leaders, chains of command. Harlem offered none of those in a form that could be seized. Influence moved through trust and memory rather than directives. The system survived because it didn't announce itself. From the outside, it might have appeared that nothing was happening. From the inside, everything was being managed. Conflicts that could have escalated were absorbed early. Economic relationships remained predictable. Information traveled quickly where it needed to and stopped where it didn't. This wasn't governance in a legal sense, but it was order. And order, once established, tends to defend itself. The court assumed that removing a figure would dismantle a structure. What Harlem demonstrated was the opposite. The structure sustained the figure. Even if enforcement had intensified, it would have faced the same obstacle, no clear entry point. Power that relies on consent does not collapse when pressured. It simply becomes quieter. This is the critical distinction between legal authority and social authority. Legal authority acts through mandates. Social authority acts through expectation. One requires compliance. The other assumes it. In Harlem, expectation carried more weight than instruction. People didn't need to be told what to do. They already knew what preserved balance. By the time the implications became clear to outsiders, the moment had passed. The order was still valid, but it had lost relevance. The law remained intact, yet disconnected from the reality it was meant to govern. What endured instead was a form of power that never claimed legitimacy, never sought recognition, and never needed enforcement. This was power without law, not chaotic, not violent, but deeply rooted. And once rooted, it proved far harder to uproot than any ruling ever could. By the time the consequences became impossible to ignore, the court's authority had not been overturned, it had been outpaced. The order against Bumpy Johnson still existed, formally valid and legally intact. What had changed was its standing in the world it was meant to govern. In Harlem, the ruling no longer functioned as guidance, it functioned as background noise. Legitimacy is not the same as legality. The court possessed the latter. Harlem withheld the former. And without legitimacy, authority becomes brittle. It can threaten, but it cannot mobilize. It can command, but it cannot compel sustained action. Over time, institutions adapt to that reality, not by admitting failure, but by quietly rerouting effort elsewhere. This is the moment where the system reveals its priorities. The state does not endlessly push against immovable resistance. It reallocates. Cases stall. Resources shift. Attention moves to targets that promise cooperation. Not because justice has been served, but because governance requires momentum. An order that cannot be executed drains credibility from those tasked with executing it. The deeper consequence is subtle and lasting. Each time a legal directive fails to translate into lived change, the gap between institutions and communities widens. Courts continue to speak in universal terms. Communities respond in local calculations. Over time, that divergence hardens into expectation. The law will decide, but life will decide whether it matters. Harlem did not replace the legal system. It exposed its limits. The court assumed that authority flows downward. The community demonstrated that authority also flows upward through consent, cooperation, and belief. When those are absent, even the most precise rulings lose traction. For the state, the lesson was uncomfortable. Enforcement strategies would have to change. Pressure alone was insufficient. Presence without legitimacy produced paralysis, and so the system adapted not by insisting harder, but by learning where insistence no longer worked. This is why the order's failure matters beyond one man. It shows that power is not merely declared, it is recognized. Law can define boundaries, but communities determine whether those boundaries hold. In Harlem, the court's authority remained formal but hollow, while a parallel order, unwritten and unofficial, continued to function. And in that coexistence lies the final truth of this story. When legal authority loses legitimacy, it doesn't disappear. It simply stops shaping reality. The judge's signature never disappeared. The order was never reversed, erased, or declared invalid. On paper, the law remained whole, but in Harlem, reality followed a different script. What this moment exposed was not corruption or weakness, but a boundary the legal system rarely acknowledges, the point where authority ends and legitimacy begins. Bumpy Johnson did not defeat the court. He didn't challenge its ruling or test its power. He simply remained anchored in a community that had already decided which system worked for them, and when that decision was made collectively, enforcement became optional rather than inevitable. The law spoke clearly. Harlem answered with silence. This is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of modern governance. Courts can rule, legislatures can legislate, but order only exists where people choose to participate in it. Without that participation, authority becomes symbolic, present in records, absent in practice. What unfolded here was not chaos, but a transfer of relevance. The legal system continued to exist, yet it no longer shaped daily life. For the state, this was not a defeat that could be announced or corrected. It was a limit that had to be absorbed. Future strategies would change. Pressure would give way to negotiation. Enforcement would seek legitimacy before force. Harlem was not an exception, it was a warning. And that is why this story matters beyond one man, one order, or one neighborhood. It asks a question that reaches far beyond crime or history. Who truly decides how order is maintained, the institutions that declare it, or the communities that live inside it every day? In Harlem, the answer was clear. The law remained intact. But power, real power, belonged to those who could make the law irrelevant without ever breaking it.